101. We're going to start today with a land acknowledgement from Cassidy Mazur, our program coordinator, our environment program coordinator. I'll do some quick introductions and then we'll get started.
Great, thanks, Abby. And I'm sure you all recognize that a land acknowledgement can be a bit strange in a virtual setting because we're not all in the same place, but I encourage you wherever you are to take some time and think about the Indigenous territory that you're on. And for us today, LOWDSA and most of our activities occur in Treaty 3 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. And today our topic is forestry, and I think it's important for us to remember that as we're talking about the beautiful trees and forests and resources of the area that we all enjoy, know that those are all culturally significant to the Anishinaabe Nation, the Métis Nation, and many other Indigenous nations. And Treaty 3 is home to 28 Anishinaabe nations who have been stewards of the land since time immemorial and have fulfilled sacred relationships and responsibilities for taking care of that land. And for LOWDSA and our Lake Smart program, we hope to honor that in our own relationships with the land and forests, water, fish, wildlife, and any other aspects that are culturally significant to the Indigenous nations. And we can do that kind of through our mission, which is to preserve one of the most beautiful places on earth as a high quality environment for future generations to enjoy. And for our Lake Smart team, we're hoping to bring what we learned at the Nibby gathering earlier this year, or water gathering, into our actions throughout the summer season. And yeah, again, today as we're focusing on forestry, I think as we think of the management and planning that goes towards that, reflect on the long-standing stewardship of this land by Indigenous people. And I'll pass it back to you, Abby.
Thanks, Cassidy. That was great. So my name is Abby Friesen. I'm an environmental stewardship technician with the Lake Smart team. We're a part of the Lake of the Woods District Stewardship Association, and our program is totally unique to the area. So for anyone who doesn't know, our team is made up of 4 post-secondary students. We're all focused in the environmental sector, and we spend our days going dock to dock, attending the farmers market, and this year also at the boat wash station, talking to people about how they can live and play green at the lake. And it's a really great job. So today, for our forestry panel, our first speaker is Ryan Haines. He's a biologist and planner with the Kenora Resource Consultants. He's been working with First Nations in Treaty 3 territory on natural resource projects since 2002. Ryan's had the contract to manage the Wabauskang Resource Office since 2015, which facilitates the consultation request for the Wabauskang First Nation. In this role, Ryan has worked with the Wabauskang community members to assist them in navigating the forest management planning process for 7 different forest management units in the Wabauskang traditional territory. Ryan has a bachelor's degree in natural resource management from the University of Northern British Columbia and a master's in rural planning and development from the University of Guelph. And he is going to be giving us a presentation today on all things forestry. So we're looking forward to that. To follow, we have Garth Collier, who sits as Vice President on LOWDSA's Executive Committee, and he'll be sharing his activities with the Local Citizens Committee, or LCC, of the MNRF. He's going to provide updates on LOWDSA's contribution to the local forest management this year. And finally, we have Sylvain Montpellier, who's joining us from the PRT team as a customer support representative. PRT has supplied LOWDSA with seedlings for our seedling day I think it's the last 5 years or so. And they've been a great partner for us, which is great. Sylvain, he provides customer support and marketing coverage to the Ontario and Great Lakes region, and he's graduated from Collège Boreal in Sudbury, Ontario in 2011. Today, he's a provisional member of the Ontario Professional Foresters Association, or the OPFA, and is in the process of becoming a registered professional forester. Sylvain has over 9 years of forestry and related experience and has coordinated tree planting programs totaling more than 24 million seedlings, both in summer and winter site preparation, aerial herbicide, cone collection, and aerial seedling programs in Northern Ontario. And finally, we have an honorary speaker who wasn't able to attend today, Kyle Machota from the MNRF, who's contributed to the presentation. And we just want to thank him for the work he did before we begin. So to start, we have a couple polls here. They're going to help us gain understanding of everyone's knowledge of forestry before we begin. And then Ryan will jump right into it.
And just as people are filling out the poll, I'll add that I'm sure there's going to be questions that come up throughout the presentation that I think Kyle would be more suited to answer. So for sure, we can put you in touch with Kyle for those when they do come up. But yeah, for sure, still submit those questions to the Q&A in case Ryan can answer. And if not, we'll pass them along. And I'll give a 10-second warning for the polls. Okay. And I'll share the results with everybody just in case you're interested to know. Looks like we've got a lot of folks that want to learn more, which is awesome.
Perfect. And I'll invite Ryan here to get going. And whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. Hopefully everyone can see me okay and can, or hear me okay and see the slide deck. I don't know, Abby, for me, I just still see the poll up in front of me. I don't know if that's true for everyone.
I think you just everybody has to exit it on their screen.
Oh, okay, I know I did it on mine. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So thank you very much. And I'd also just, Cassidy, thank you much. That was a very thoughtful land acknowledgement, and definitely really appreciate, again, the thought you put into that. That was great. As Abby mentioned, and hopefully people picked up on, I am not a forester. I kind of came to be involved with forestry through my work with First Nations communities and helping facilitate their involvement in the forest management planning process and how they could bring their interests and priorities to the forest management planning table. So through that lens, hopefully I can help inform different folks that have joined this meeting and in terms of how you can become engaged in the forest planning process, and similarly make sure that your values and interests can be reflected in that process. So for the presentation today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ecological principles, kind of I guess the science behind forestry, some of the legislation and context and history, which I think is important to understand kind of how the forest management planning process came to be how it is. Some of the recent changes in terms of social license and its importance now for how corporations operate and the role certification plays in that. We'll talk about the forest management planning cycle and how forest management planning works in Ontario, a summary of that, and then opportunities for public input. So I think one thing that's important to remember, and I think we were all reminded of this in the last day or two here with the smoke that's kind of descended on the Kenora area. We are very much in the boreal forest, which is a fire-driven ecosystem. Our fires have evolved to have a regular cycle of fire, regrowth, And this is just part of the cycle, and which results in changes to the ecological composition of the forest. And so, but these natural changes, when we, with the fire regrowth and that cycle, really started to change when the province started really aggressive fire suppression, and in particular with increased access, modification of airplanes and all that, we've become very, very good at putting out fires and doing it quickly. And as a result, we've really changed this kind of fire-driven ecosystem and how our forests have, kind of naturally evolved to have their stages of succession, and that's resulted into changes to the ecological composition of the forest. And it's also important to remember that this is the boreal forest and not a coastal rainforest setting. So this is not Cathedral Grove or Fairy Creek. Like when we talk about older forests, it looks more like a bunch of matchsticks falling down on the ground than it does your 2 meter wide western red cedar that you would find on the west coast. So it's a very different context when we talk about old growth forest. Often foresters around here will talk about over mature, and I think often what they're talking about is a forest that under natural conditions would have likely already been subject to fire and a change in the forest succession. So that's kind of the context for kind of our landscape here. And again, so one of the challenges facing any natural resource manager when they look at an area where there has been significant changes to the natural way of things, right, is how do you then manage that resource? And as a result, our forestry activities have evolved to emulate natural disturbances. So that's just an effort to try and mimic what fire does and do it with sustainable management of the forest in terms of harvesting. Now, it isn't perfect. I think I will be the first to say that the foresters can be a little selective as to when and where they say that the fire, they're completely mimicking fire. But I think often as best they can, that this drives a lot of the forest management planning and when and where harvesting takes place. So obviously there's the business needs that layers over top of that, which we'll get into. But this emulating natural forest disturbance patterns, mimicking fire, really provides the foundation for forest management planning. And some examples of that, if you look at the photo on the left, you've got a fire that's gone through this area. And then the photo on the right, you've got a cut block. Similar size. There's some trees left in both. You can see there are some differences, right? There's still the standing dead burn trees on the left, but a lot of the size and shape of the cut blocks are designed to really mimic what a fire would do had a fire been allowed to burn without aggressive fire suppression. And just one other thing to think about, I think for cottagers is, I know I've got a home on Island Lake just north of Kenora, and we abut on the Whiskey Jack Forest, where there hasn't been any forestry activity for almost 20 years. And I kind of look a little suspiciously now at the forest to the north of us, where we have really nothing between us and that. And just in terms of with a fire-based ecosystem and aggressive fire suppression, I mean, if there isn't any harvesting there, then what is the fire protection plan, right? It's just basically every year that there's either no logging or aggressive fire suppression and no other tools used, whether it's prescribed burns or whatever tools could be used to try and limit the amount of fuel available in the forest. You are increasing the risk to your, and not to say that logging is the only way to come up with a fire protection plan, but I think if there isn't, then it's something that I think every cottager should think about is how then their cottage is protected from forest fires. So the legislative context for forest management in Ontario, and I think this is important to really, if you start to look at the forest management planning process and how it came to be, I think it helps to understand kind of the legislation in Ontario. So in 1990, the Environmental Assessment Act came into force, and with it, then became so that all forest management activities, every cut block was then subject to an environmental assessment. And I think that the response from the forest industry is this was kind of untenable in that it was difficult for them to plan. EA is a very cumbersome process and can be, you know, subjected to different uncertainties. And so there was a request that, you know, if rather than have an environmental assessment for every cut block, can there be a list of terms and conditions for forest management where if those conditions are met for all harvesting operations, then that would satisfy the environmental assessment requirements. And forestry isn't the only activity in the province to have a Class EA, but Class EAs were typically or are typically used in areas where doing an environmental assessment for every activity really isn't a good fit, but they want to make sure that, you know, that those conditions are still being met. So initially, in 1994, they came out with the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. And the Crown Forest Sustainability Act for the next 26 years was always had the Environmental Assessment Act kind of hanging over it. And any time that there has been, there were bump up requests where if someone felt that the Crown Forest Sustainability Act was not meeting those environmental assessment requirements, that you could request Ministry of Environment to actually do a review of how the forests are being managed. That changed in 2020, so that now it's just the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. It doesn't have that link to the Environmental Assessment Act, but the conditions are really still there. I think the view of the province last year was that it was just a duplication. And so now the Crown Forest Sustainability Act is the only legislation, and this Class EA no longer exists. But those conditions do. They've since dropped from the 155, but all this to say it is a very onerous process with a lot of requirements that are put on the people who are developing these forest management plans. And that'll really kind of drive, when I talk about the forest management planning process and what happens at these meetings, it's really understanding how this process is really driven around meeting these environmental requirements to satisfy those, and it helps explain, I think, a lot of what's going on at these meetings, the forest management planning team meetings. And then ultimately it's sustainable forest licenses is how the forests are managed. So these are issued for different areas. They were used to be associated with specific mills, and it's kind of evolving now where there's this hybrid model or it's not a hybrid model, but there's a hybrid where some forests are still managed by companies, like the Trout Lake Forest and the Dryden Forest still managed by Domtar. You've got some forests that are being managed by new kind of hybrid First Nation models. Kenora Forest with Misan and Mitigug is one example of that. Some forests are managed by kind of groups of loggers, and example, I think Red Lake Forest and Wabauskang Forest. So it's really the sustainable forest license is all going through kind of a transition right now. That the Whiskey Jack is still is managed by the province. I think they've just issued the contract to Misan to do that work, but it's still the province that holds that sustainable forest license. So another piece that is, I think, becoming more and more important in the forest industry and how forest companies and forest management companies operate is forest certification. And this is a voluntary tool used to gain market access, but it's really become based on consumer demand, where lots of people, when they're buying products, really want to see certification so that they can have some comfort that the forests are being managed and where the trees come from is being managed in a way that's been independently verified to be well managed. So much so that there are some companies like, I can't remember now, Home Depot, but they will only buy wood of a certain certification, and that becomes a requirement for anyone looking at selling wood to them. So this is driven where the company will then pay the certification group to come in and do an assessment of their operations, let them know what they have to improve to be able to meet their requirements. And then by getting that certification, the idea is that they're able to access more markets and command a higher dollar value for their products. So it's a consumer driven model, and it does address a wide range of topics and issues that can often really extend beyond what's in the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. You will get everything like Indigenous engagement becomes much more important, species at risk, things like, and often these certification companies will look like really from right from the forest itself, and then how it is delivered, and all those types of things. So it really is a wider ranging process for certifying the forests. And this is just a map of certified forests in the province, and I'll just focus on northwestern Ontario. You can see right on the Manitoba border there, you've got the Kenora Forest, which is SFI certified. So that's Sustainable Forestry Initiative. And then you got the Forest Stewardship Council certification, which is in orange. And so you've got the Dryden Forest that has both FSC and SFI certification. And the gap there, you can see the Whiskey Jack and Red Lake forests do not currently have any certification on them. But you can see most of the forests across the province do have some level of certification, part of that kind of consumer driven model. So as I mentioned, we'll just talk a little about forest management planning process. So this is really a very technical process aimed at meeting the onerous requirements of an environmental assessment. Like there's lots of modeling and very technical work and that goes into this. And it's important to keep in mind, if you do get invited to participate at the forest management planning team table, this is not designed as a public engagement process. I've really learned this the hard way. What happened was forest management planning activities were happening, and these very technical discussions were happening, and there was some pressure that people didn't like these discussions taking place behind closed doors. So they've opened it up so that different groups are invited to send representatives to sit in on these meetings, but the nature of the meetings hasn't changed, and often you can spend half an hour listening to two foresters talk about whether the ecological codes should change for a certain, from this to this, for certain forest types, and it is a very technical process. But there are opportunities, the desired forests and benefits meetings, operational planning, there are public houses for meaningful public engagement. So I think the planning process itself is not set up as a public engagement process, but there are specific, points of time during this where I think it's important for people who want to be part, like have their input, but don't want to sit through, a 3-hour meeting every few weeks. They can still have meaningful engagement and have influence over the process. So the way forests are managed in Ontario is every forest needs to manage for a 10-year time period. So the plan is for a 10-year time period. I know for the, I think Kenora Forest just is finishing up their plan for an upcoming 10-year period. The Whiskey Jack just started theirs for 2023 to 2033, I think. So there's these 10-year blocks, but the planning for those typically takes 2 to 3 years. And this is 2 to 3 years of a group of anywhere between, depending on public input, maybe anywhere between 8 and 12 people, or maybe 6 and 12 people, that depending, who are really focused on planning this forest over this 3-year period. And they'll bring in different technical expertise as needed, depending on biologists or people with modeling experience, but silviculture experts to help support the process. But it is really and at the first stage, and this is on the Whiskey Jack, just went through the values and objectives exercise, or is going through that kind of in the first part of the planning stage. And then it's looking at, okay, the values and objectives, what does that mean on the land in terms of harvest areas, roads, silviculture? And then there's the implementing, where this is the 10-year stage of where they're actually implementing, right? What came out of the plan. And then after that, if it's not effective, well, there's monitoring and evaluating through legislated audits. And whether that's through the FMP process, the provincial process needs audits, as well as any certification process. There's also auditing that goes on to monitor and evaluate. So if you're interested in getting involved in forest management planning, action item 1 is really define your forest of interest. So as I mentioned, there's these forest management areas, and I think everyone's got different forests, maybe more than one, but that they're more interested in and have more impacts on their lives. So make sure that you know which forest that you're interested in and familiarize yourself with that, and then you can get involved, whether it's being on a mailing list for the forest. There's local citizens committees that are there, and they have you can either join the local citizens committee or contact your representative, who will hopefully be sitting at the planning team meetings, making sure they're bringing your interests forward. Ministry of Natural Resources is ultimately responsible for making sure that the forest management planning process is occurring as per the provincial requirements. So you can call, mail, or email your concerns to the forest manager at the Ministry of Natural Resources. And as I mentioned, there are key times where there's opportunity to attend public consultation meetings and open houses to be part of the forest management planning process. So it's just another way of showing the same thing, taking place over 2 to 3 years, invitation to participate at the beginning, and then review of long-term management direction in stage 2. So again, the first part is really the strategic planning phase. And this usually takes place over about the first year of the planning process, and the next 1 to 2 years is operational planning, when looking at what's actually happening on the ground to make sure that, with the touchstones being what happened in the strategic planning in terms of what was hoping will be met out on the land. So I'll go through this quickly. I think I'm getting close to the end of my time. So this, again, just stage 1 and 2 are strategic level decisions. What do you want the forest to look like? Management objectives, desired forests and benefits, long-term management direction. And really you've got this Venn diagram here, and the sweet spot that everyone's supposed to be aiming for is you've got the environment, the economy, and society, and where those all meet, and addressing all those interests and balancing those interests is kind of the goal of forest managers, or what they're supposed to be striving for in this process. And then stage 3 and 4, operational level decisions. So this is where harvesting, renewal, tending. And so when we talk about tending, often, well, that's often can be a controversial one. So that can often involve spraying herbicides, which, depending on the forest and area, can be an area of contention. Buffer zones, whether there's specific places are set aside for winter harvesting. These are kind of the operation level decisions that take place in stage 3 and 4. And within the forest management plan, there are some objectives that are mandatory and that must be in the plan. They're requirements, and like forest diversity, social and economics, ecological sustainability, and then silviculture, that the forest needs to be renewed. And you can see, you kind of get into that Venn diagram again, mandatory, building in all of these mandatory objectives. And then again, there is opportunity for additional objectives. So these are developed by the planning team as a result of different public input opportunities, such as the desired forest and benefit meetings. These can be, where roads are, or whether or not roads stay open or are, decommissioned. additional environmental protection measures, whether that's buffers or changes into when and how forestry takes place, moose enhancement areas, etc. I mean, it's really not limited by anything other than what the interests are of the planning team and what comes out of the desired forest and benefits meetings. And I think this important is what if the planning team does not listen? If you know, you really do feel that through the planning process that they are not meeting their requirements and haven't, you know, whether it's those mandatory requirements that need to be in the plan, or you know, things that they should have heard from the desired forests and benefits and, you know, the planning team priorities, that those haven't been addressed. There is an issue resolution process for issues not solved during the consultation process. Every 5 to 7 years, every forest has a forest audit, which is a legal requirement to address the auditor's findings. So look for invitations to participate in those. And then any forests that are certified will go through audits on a regular basis as well. And they will also be seeking input from the public and people who are impacted by the forest to see whether or not you know, the requirements with those forest certifications and what they kind of hold the forest manager to, whether those are being met as well. So just in summary, just remember, for input into the forest management planning process, there will be invitations from the province, from forest managers, and from auditors. So whether it's, you know, invited for any contingency plans, the 10-year forest management plan, there's an issue resolution process. Every year there's annual work schedule reviews to kind of look at every year how they're meeting the requirements of the forest management plan, independent forest audits, and forest certification. So that was it for me, and those are just opportunities, and I'll just stop there, and I don't know if we're moving on to questions, or if I'll turn it back over to Abby.
Thanks, Ryan. I actually do have a couple questions before we move on, if that's okay. Can you hear me all right?
Certainly, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, let's see if I can, perfect. So what would you say is the most commonly misunderstood component of the forestry industry? So like for the public in general, and then what would be the most important aspect to gain an understanding of?
The one thing I've never understood about the forest industry in general is it's almost like they need to hire someone to do their marketing for them, because the forest industry, and I think rightly so, back in like probably the 1980s, got a bad reputation, in particular in northwestern Ontario. I think there were a lot of very large clear cuts that were not very environmentally sustainable. But since then, like in the, you know, with the Environmental Assessment Act, Crown Forest, there have been a lot of changes over the last 30, 40 years. But for whatever reason, and I think it's just getting caught in the legislative changes, and when things are embedded in legislation, that the province's unwillingness or inability to change it. But the term clear cut is like what a clear cut is today, and they still call it a clear cut, doesn't look anything like a clear cut did 30, 40 years ago. And yet for some reason that the province has been really reluctant to do any kind of branding around that. And it's something I don't understand. They still, and get there's a lot of connotations around when people talk about cut blocks, and I think some people anyway think about, you know, what they would have seen in photos, or even when they've gone for a drive, say north of Kenora in the 1980s, and it is very different now in terms of the size of the cuts, the trees that are getting left there, and it's got a very different appearance, and I've never understood why the province never did find another term for it to kind of rebrand it, because it does have a lot of I mean, there's a lot of baggage that they inherit with that term.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. I was also wondering, so you were mentioning that the forestry activities, they mimic forest fires, and it's meant to like maintain, obviously you're talking about the cut blocks and how they're designed to make sure that even though the disturbance isn't happening naturally, it's still happening at some point. How does that work in protected areas like parks and places where logging isn't allowed?
So parks have been an interesting one because they've really had to go through this process, and I mean, I think for some of them it's taken a while to get there, but I mean, we have a lot of national parks in the boreal forest here, but I know in Nova Scotia, Buena Vista National Park, they've had to kind of section out their park in terms of where their critical infrastructure is, like where, you know, their important picnic areas and or their, you know, office buildings are. But other than that, they've got huge swaths of that park where now if there are any forest fires, they don't, there's no fire suppression, they just monitor them. And they only actually go in and suppress the fires if there's any potential impact to, you know, if it's going to start to go across a highway and isolate. But really, they make every effort to let those fires burn, just recognizing that it's and you know that an important part of the ecological cycle. A little closer to home, I know provincial parks, Woodland Caribou Provincial Park, which is a large remote park on just west of Dryden, right on the Manitoba border. They have a policy of, you know, monitoring fire and not with active fire suppression for the same reasons. And even on Lake of the Woods, I think on islands, and depending on the island or where the fire is, they've started to look into letting some of those fires burn as well, and not going through active fire suppression to let those islands where, you know, they're not as concerned about them spreading and impacting, you know, local communities or any infrastructure, letting those burn to allow those natural ecological processes to take place.
Cool, thank you. I guess we'll move on to Garth here, and he can give us a little rundown of what he's been doing on the local citizens committee of the MNRF.
Thank you, Abby.
There we go.
And thank you, Ryan. Ryan, you made it easier for me because you said a lot of things that I was going to say, and that's fine because I can be efficient with our time. Basically, I've been a director for the last couple of years on the Lake of the Woods Stewardship Association. 2 years ago, I got involved with the LCC, which is known as the Local Citizens Committee. Primarily LOWDSA, as we call it. Our mission is to inform, educate, and facilitate discussions between, you know, stakeholders. We are not a political organization. So we try to provide information and educate and encourage members to be actively involved in the caring for the long-term health of our area. In terms of my role on the LCC, we meet regularly. There's meetings about the Kenora Forest, and on the other side, just generally on the other side of the Winnipeg River, we meet about the Whiskey Jack Forest. This is an important part of the process that Ryan's referring to. This is where we have input into, you know, the different perspectives that go into the forest management plan. At our last meeting, I think we had 25 people representing different areas. They were participating in the meeting. These people would be, say, Indigenous, they'd be harvesters, they'd be reps from the ministry, property owners. We talk about use of herbicides. And I think it's important to note that using herbicides is something that really doesn't happen a lot in our particular area. The stakeholders just don't want it, and the ministry abides by that. There may be situations where they would have to go in and do a special spray with invasive species, but that would be done with backpack sprayers. There's no aerial spraying done. East of Kenora, in the Dryden area, they are spraying for, and it may be over already because it's a very sensitive period of time, but they're spraying for the jack pine budworm, which is really, really aggressive insect that is destroying the new growth on the young and fledgling jack pines. Other items that we talk about, wildlife habitats, whether it's spawning, moose habitat, caribou in some cases, deer habitat. The stakeholders on the LCC help to identify vulnerable areas. We try to preserve blueberry picking areas, cedar stands, which are used for traditional purposes. Eagles' nests are given huge buffer zones. Herons, rookeries are protected. We talk about that, and we make sure that those concerns are expressed in and covered off in the plan. I think I've sort of covered everything. The whiskey jack is at stage 3. We're looking at the public consultation stage coming up. And that's me, sorry folks. And stage 4 is the Kenora forest, where we're getting ready to the final consultation, and stuff will be inscribed into the forest management plan. Concerns, as Ryan had said, that aren't resolved at that point will go to the resolution process. We're not there yet in either of the forest areas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Marika. It's Shannon calling from Dr. Burnell's office.
Sorry.
That's me.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
So if someone wanted to get involved now with you in this process when you're in stage 3, is that still possible, or is that not possible?
I'd have to say yes. We had, I think, 5 of us representing LOWDSA at a meeting 2 weeks ago, and 4 of the 5 were new people. So I'd say absolutely. I could connect you with, say, either Kyle or the new forester on the Whiskey Jack side, and we could get you going.
Awesome. Thank you. And our last speaker for the day, we have Sylvain, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about reforestation and his work in with PRD.
Thanks, Abby. Can I share my screen? Do I just click share screen? I have a presentation too.
Perfect.
Okay, you should be able to now, unless Ryan, you might have to stop share before Sylvain can share. There we go.
Okay, can you see the presentation? Just PRT, Sylvain?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. Sylvain Montpellier. I live in Marathon and currently in Sudbury. Both, I believe, are Anishinaabe traditional territory. And yeah, I've been working with PRT for heading on 3 years now. So far, so good. I really enjoy this this path I've taken. I wanted to maybe talk a bit about aerial reforestation as a method to regenerate our forests. There are a few methods for this type of reforestation. I'd say the most recent innovation is aerial planting with drones. The science is very interesting, although the concept is a really good concept. However, for anything that's walking beneath, dropping trees in these little pods has been a bit dangerous for wildlife and anyone picking berries. Although as the first time I saw it, I was very excited, and they started doing this in California on sites that they have full control of what can be entering the area where they're planting. Very efficient. The yeah, technology is great, but it's not applicable in our forests since we have plenty of wildlife that come into these areas. The second most common would be with a plane, and then what we have is helicopter aerial seeding. Both of these have their own pros and cons. A plane is low cost. However, it doesn't have the mobility that a helicopter does. So a helicopter is more expensive, but you could cover more area with the seed that you have. And you could land anywhere, while a plane would need to land in an airport. So there's a few options, whichever one works better for the land manager. The forest manager is what they'll move forward with. Aerial seeding in Ontario is generally done with 2 species. I would say jack pine is the preferred species, and then there's black spruce. The one thing, I haven't done too much aerial seeding, but the one thing I learned, I figured it out the hard way, is that sites basically have to be perfect for aerial seeding, meaning you can almost not have, you can't have any competition, right? So as soon as you start having any grasses or advanced growth, like any poplars or birch coming in, or even willow or alders, your aerial seeding program may not be successful. The second thing is to at least have 60% exposure to appropriate seed beds. So that means for jack pine, it would be sand flats or silts or pockets of soil on top of rock caps. And for black spruce, like I was going to put up some pictures of the sand and silts, but everyone kind of knows what that would generally look like. For black spruce, it would be sphagnum moss. That is the most ideal moss or seedbed that's required for black spruce. Black spruce typically grows on damp and moist sites. So sphagnum mosses hold that type of moisture that provides enough to the black spruce seed. And just to give you guys, just to compare the other mosses, and these are just 2 big families. I mean, there's thousands of individual species, but the biggest difference in between a sphagnum moss and a feather moss is if you were to grab just a clump with your hand and squeeze it, the sphagnum moss will actually drip out a significant amount of water, while feather moss would not drip anything, very, very dry. And that's why it's not suitable for any sort of seeding, aerial seeding activity. However, feather moss has some of the best soils in my experience just underneath the moss itself, which would be the layer O or A, just before B, which would be your mineral soils. That very fine organic material is, in my opinion, the best material for seed germination. And I put this piece of equipment that's, if there's a site, for example, that is very difficult to access, let's say it was cut during the winter, and to get planters to this site is almost impossible. You could bring in some sort of piece of equipment either in the winter or in late winter, where you could bring in some sort of piece of equipment like this and just scrub off that top layer of feather moss. And that would allow you to expose some of the mineral soil for jack pine seeds or black spruce. Okay, next. Another important thing to consider during any sort of aerial regeneration is the timing of the year. The best time is, well, the 2 options are late winter or early spring. So again, they both have their pros and cons. Every forester is going to be different, and they're going to suggest their own approach. Late winter gives you the ability to monitor how many seeds have actually been applied and the coverage, right? So it's easy to just walk the block and visually see that the area has been seeded. The bad part is that so do birds. Birds see all these nice seeds and they stand out very well on the snow. That is the downfall. My preference would be early spring where the snow is still patchy and you get some sort of, while you do get your mineral soil exposure, the birds don't really get to it. And in the spring, you typically have a lot more moisture, just more rain. The ground is cooler and generally more saturated and enough to stratify the seed. And without getting into too many details, because I don't want to throw anybody, confuse anyone, one of the reasons why jack pine and black spruce are favored is because of the duration, the length of stratification for these seeds. Both of these species takes about 21 days to prepare, and the way you prepare it is just saturating the seeds at a constant temperature for an extended period of time, and that period is 21 days. Any other species, you're talking about 45 days or even 90 days for white pine, for example, 75 to 90 days for white pine. The seed has to be constantly damp for it to stratify and germinate in the field. So there's many things happening all at once to make sure that that aerial seeding program is successful. So aerial seeding works well, but only on the right site and at the right time. There are a few misconceptions about just reforestation in Ontario and Canada as a whole. And I've heard before that some people think that our forests are just not being properly regenerated. And that's generally not accurate. There's some sites that are designed to regenerate naturally. One of them would be poplar. For example, as soon as you cut a poplar tree, and the life of a poplar can be in between 60 to 90 years old, that's the typical rotation of a poplar stand. As soon as you bring in equipment and you remove those poplars, all of the stumps and the roots from each individual poplar will sprout into 15 to 20 new poplars. So for a poplar site, there's no artificial regeneration needed. Poplar is a natural species in the boreal forest. It's not the MNR's intent to ever remove poplar 100%. Poplar is natural and we need those stands. There are some species that are designed to live in these stands. And as Ryan indicated in his presentation, forest managers or sawmills in Ontario and Canada as a whole, they must follow the Crown Forest Sustainability Act. And this act requires companies to submit strict rules on regenerating sites. And without these rules in place, their plan would just simply not be approved. So because a block is not planted, it doesn't mean it was forgotten. And by that, I don't mean you can expect perfection in any cut block. I mean, it does happen. However, it rarely falls off the plate because as soon as it's been harvested, it becomes flagged as a liability to these sawmills. And sawmills are now required to make sure that these sites regenerate. FMPs, they generally encourage, although we leave these sites to come back naturally. There are some old and degraded mixed wood sites that have most likely begun with a pure conifer stand. As a site just degrades over time, probably one of the worst things you could do in the boreal forest is never let anything happen to that forest. Fire naturally is the best thing for it. Like it's been mentioned a few times, we put out fires. There's now different sorts of values. There's a species at risk. There's highways. There's everything, right? Cottages. We put out these fires. So in these sites that have never or haven't had any sort of disturbance for a very long time are now degraded and have turned into shrubs or large white spruce stands. As soon as these white spruce fall down, there's nothing that's going to come out of that site unless something happens to it, either a fire or we restart the site artificially with equipment. So like I said, the best thing for that site would be a disturbance. And in that situation, because it would have probably originated from a pure conifer stand, the industry is encouraged to bring it back to a conifer stand. The last thing industry wants to do is go into a poplar stand, like you see on this image, and turn it into a conifer stand. That's not what it naturally was, and you'll be fighting it forever because the stand just wants to be a poplar stand. And the next species that we would leave for natural is birch. Although the roots don't take off, the stumps will, I believe it's called coppice, where each stump will take off into 5 to 10 birch trees and regenerate a birch stand naturally, which is, of course, it's great that we're able to have this sort of relationship with what would naturally happen. The one that I find most fascinating is the lowland black spruce, and the acronym for it is CLAG. If you see on the side of the highway, like I see this all the time, and I usually pull over and make sure it was done right. CLAG stands for careful logging around advanced growth. So are you able to see my mouse when I move around? Yeah, okay. So the industry would come in and harvest the taller of the spruce while making or having an extreme, being extremely careful around the advanced growth, which would be these smaller ones. So that's why you would see nice, oh no. There you go. So that's why you would see larger strip cuts in between these sites, because they're paying attention to the smaller of the seedlings, and that helps in regenerating the site naturally. Any black spruce, it doesn't work for every black spruce stand because you need that advanced growth. But I absolutely, when this is done properly, it is the most beautiful thing. You come back 5 years after, and the whole path that was done by the skid trail is regenerating naturally. It's really a beautiful thing. So every site that gets harvested, regardless if it's regenerated naturally or artificially, is a liability to the licensee. And usually the licensee is the sawmill, meaning they are responsible for that site until it is adequately regenerated. And each type of stand, without going in, again too deep into this, each stand has its own standards. Like if you go on a rock cap and you harvest the minimal amount of trees that are on there, of course you can't bring that back into a fully stocked solid stand. I mean, the site was never allowing that to happen anyways. So there's different standards on different sites. But most poplar and birch are usually left for natural. So red pine seedlings, I remember a couple years ago speaking with Deanna about species and what would be the most suitable for your area. And my suggestion was red pine, which is also known as Norway pine. That's just quick pictures of what it would look like as a mature seedling. And one of the reasons is that red pine have very little, if any, genetic diversity. And that means that any red pine seedling that's been found in Newfoundland almost had the same genetic composition as a red pine that was found in Minnesota or Wisconsin. And the reason they think this is the way it is, there may have been some sort of genetic bottleneck during the glacial retreat, of course, a long time ago. And some of these species, some of these stands of this species may have become borderline extinct. And there must have been at one point some glacial movement from one of the stands that was remaining, and just a flow of water carrying these cones or these seeds spreading across the distribution map that we see here today. Almost all of these red pine, you could take a red pine from Minnesota and plant it in Newfoundland or Quebec, and you would see similar performances. And that's one of the reasons why I thought that would be the best species to equip the group. And the other reason would be it's generally quite versatile in the site you are planting it. It does need 100% sun. It needs full sun, and most cottage locations have some sort of green space and would benefit from having that red pine planted on that site, since it would get 100% sun or a lot of sun. If you are driving around on any lake that has red pine in the area, you'll also see that the shores have some really, really big red pine. The reason for that, the way the roots develop, it allows them to be quite strong against winds. They have long lateral roots that also have smaller roots that go deeper into the soils. That's what allows them to stand up so strong. I think that's all I had. Oh, one more thing. Red pine grows extremely well in drier sites. As long as it's not saturated, the red pine would perform quite well. And if anyone wanted to get more information on just how red pine kind of made its way across Canada or across Ontario in these areas, you can look at this link, and there's a very interesting study that came out of it, and I encourage anyone to visit this website. And that's all I got for today.
Thank you, Sylvain.
Mm-hmm.
So I would invite anyone who would like to ask a question right now to send that into the Q&A function. I also have a question about, for our LOWDSA members, we do a seedling day, every year. And I think as a membership base, I think we've planted over 300,000 trees. And what do you think going forward? So for generations, me planting with my grandma or, with my little cousins, like what the success rate would be for the trees that we're planting, let's say on our island. So for picking near the shoreline, or maybe a little bit farther in the bush, as long as it's in direct sun and not too wet, you think they'll be okay?
That's a good question. What I'm going to say is that even in the most perfect growing conditions, so we grab, let's say, an example, one of the boxes of seedlings that we supply your group with, you will not get 100% survival. There are some genetic flaws that happen throughout the storage process, and the trees just don't make it. Naturally, some seedlings that have germinated in the forest and have gone through a growing cycle, you'll see them not making it through winter. Those are just genetic flaws. That being said, it shouldn't be more than 4 or 5%. So that's a small number. Providing that the seedlings were properly stored, properly handled, and planted during the correct window, I can't see why those seedlings would not survive for a long time. And that's the beauty of red pine, is that you can, because someone may have grabbed the bundle and they're from Toronto or they're from Quebec, and they just have a camp at Lake of the Woods. If they brought that bundle to Quebec, it should survive because of the little genetic variation there is. And that's why it's just an ideal species to use for your programs.
Right. Thank you. And let's see here. Are you going to be moderating the Q&A, Cassidy?
Yeah, do you have a couple, any more for Sylvain, or maybe the one that you had for Ryan?
Yeah, perfect. So Ryan, so I was wondering, in the forestry process, like if there's an unforeseen event that disrupts an ongoing plan, let's say you're in stage 3 or 4, will they just stop the process and find a new location, or like what would be the process for if you found like an endangered species, or there was something that would make the plan stop? Like how do they, I don't know if I'm wording that correctly, but.
For sure. So you mean if they encounter something where they're unable to harvest for whatever reason, environmental or
Yeah, because obviously, there's a large amount of resources, time, and effort that goes into a plan. And if something unforeseen comes up, will they just say, oh, okay, well, that didn't work, let's move on? Or like, what would be the process for that?
So I think then probably this is over time learned, and this would be a good question, I guess, for a forester to answer, but I do know, I mean, they have been doing this long enough, you might get a forest fire, you might find, like you said, sites that you didn't realize was there sometimes, and I think it's getting better and better. Sometimes they will get into an area and the wood they thought was there isn't there, right? The forest inventory work wasn't. So, but this is all built into the 10-year plan, which has lots of flexibility in terms of contingencies built in. And often, I mean, depending on what's happening in the forest industry, these plans are often designed around best case scenario where every mill's running at full capacity. So more often than not, forestry is very cyclical, that over the course of the plan, there's often, extra areas that they had designated for harvesting and had gone through the planning process that they end up not using. And you'll often see where sometimes they'll just carry those over into future years, or those will be their contingencies if there's a forest fire, or like you said, if they come across some environmental protected areas that they can't access, harvest block that's been identified. There are contingencies built into the planning process to take that into account, because I think they recognize over 10 years and a broad landscape that they are going to run into the wood for whatever reason that they had planned on.
Okay, I have a question that says, did I hear Sylvain say that drones are being used to plant seeds? And are the helicopters and planes dropping seeds or small trees? And there's a part 2 of that that asks about this being recorded. And yes, the session is being recorded and we will post it on our social platforms for people to watch later. Off to you, Sylvain.
Thanks. There are some landowners that are regenerating their agricultural lands in the form of afforestation, but these properties are generally quite controlled. There's fences around. This limits wildlife from coming into these sites, or even anyone from just going on an adventure and crossing this field. This would be a controlled environment, and in that case, drones are dropping miniature trees. So they have been germinated, they have started growing. Not really feasible with a helicopter or a plane, since those roots basically have to land in some sort of soil. With a drone and in a site where there's no standing trees, they can guarantee that these plugs are landing in the ground and that the roots would be protected from any sort of drought because they're in the ground. In the forest, we have all sorts of debris, just old branches. Even we intentionally leave trees standing for wildlife purposes in these blocks. And it would just be a huge waste to go through the effort of growing these seedlings and then having maybe a third to a half of them not even landing in soil. But they do, it's common practice. I've never been fortunate enough to take advantage of aerial seeding. Just the forest I was working on just simply did not allow it. I didn't have enough mineral soil exposure. But around Domtar, they do a lot of aerial seeding. Around Timmins and Sudbury, I don't know if anyone knows where the watershed is in between Timmins and Sudbury. It's pretty much 100% sand. That's a very suitable site for jack pine seeds. Yeah.
Great. And I know we're over time here a bit, but if anyone has other questions to submit, please do. I think we all can hang on a little bit longer. And I have a question for you, Sylvain. Earlier when you mentioned the stratification period for seeds, is the stratification like occurring in the field after the seeds drop, or does that happen before the seeds get dropped sometimes?
I don't know of it being done before the seeds are dropped. The risk of jamming seeds because they're getting stuck together in equipment might be the limiting factor. And there's no way to tell unless the pilot, and he does, and he's supposed to once in a while, periodically look and make sure seeds are still coming through. But before you figure that out, it could be half a kilometer of seed that should have been dropped and that hasn't. And now how do you find that exact swath of seeds that haven't been dropped? So it's not done before, and it naturally happens. And that's why in early spring is the best time to do it.
Great. Another question for you is, when the drones drop the seedlings in the plugs, what are the plugs made of, and do they biodegrade?
That's a good question. I don't have any experience with these drones. However, with what I know about them is it is a biodegradable container, and I imagine it's probably made out of a very thin layer of paper. I know that back in the day, like 30, maybe even 40 years ago, they used to grow seedlings in these paper pods, and the trees survived very well, but it had an impact on root growth. So the thick paper plugs were a very good idea, but it wasn't really suitable for industrial regeneration for the forest. It did have a small impact on root development.
Great, thank you. I'll give people a 1-minute warning if they have any other questions for our awesome panelists, but I'll maybe pass it off to Abby to close.
Sure. And maybe also a chance for panelists if you have questions for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, then will say thank you so much for coming today and all the work leading up to today that you've put in, numerous emails and collaboration and assigned group projects, which we really, really appreciate. And I think all of our members and anyone who's going to be watching the recorded version are really going to enjoy learning about. So thank you for all of your time. And it's been really great. I feel like I learned a ton, and I hope that everyone else did too. So thank you. And thank you to our sponsors as well, who help support our activities like this.
Awesome.
Everyone.
Okay, well,
Bye now.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you, yeah, for everyone who came today. So hope you have a great
Thank
day.
you. You guys are awesome.
You too.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good day.